In this presentation, you will learn about post-structuralism. Post-structuralism is a style of critical reasoning that focuses on the moment of slippage in our systems of meaning as a way to identify right there in that ambiguous space the ethical choices that we make, whether in our writings or in everyday life, when we overcome the ambiguity and move from indeterminacy to certainty of belief in an effort to understand, interpret, or shape our social environment. Post-structuralism concentrates on the moment when we impose meaning in a space that is no longer characterized by shared social agreement over the structure of meaning. It attempts to explain how it comes about that we fill those gaps in our knowledge and come to hold as true what we do believe and at what distributive cost to society and the contemporary subject. By so clearly identifying points of slippage, post-structuralism clears the table and makes plain the significant role of ethical choice, by which we can mean decision making that is guided by beliefs about virtue and the self, not by moral or political principle. So, in simple words, what we're trying to say is post-structuralism is about filling in the gaps and making it into a proper structure for us to be able to understand and believe in the subject matter properly. Post-structuralism is, in this sense, a penultimate stage in the emancipation from that self-incurred immaturity that Kant famously identified in his essay, What is Enlightenment? As the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. In that essay, Kant elaborated the central features of enlightenment, and his essay played a key role in the philosophical discourse of modernity. Post-structuralism and anthropology. Foucault and his impact. Post-structuralism is a term loosely applied to members of the next generation of French thinkers after Levi-Strauss, who also concerned themselves with texts and discourses. Of these thinkers, Michel Foucault had the greatest impact on anthropology. Foucault's work is specifically concerned with the relationship between knowledge and power. Knowledge for Foucault is not primarily a collection of facts or even ideas, but only takes on significance within what he calls an episteme, an overarching framework situated in time within which such ideas emerge as relevant and indeed possible. So, what we're trying to say is Foucault had a very important concept. For him, knowledge was not just some ideas put together, but how you use that knowledge in time, in your situation, in the most relevant way. Though Foucault avoids Marxist terminology, one might characterize his epistemes as modes of thinking as opposed to modes of production. In a similar way, he situates power within a framework of possibilities determined by an overall system rather than as a property of individual actors. In Discipline and Punish, 1975, he uses the modern prison system as a central example of how these two systems of knowledge and of power are fused in contemporary society. Discipline is, he argues, a central feature of modern institutions, prison, army, school, inscribing power relations on the bodies of subjects who must conform but must also be constantly monitored. This monitoring of subjects is the intellectual task of modern disciplines, psychology, sociology, anthropology, and others. Edward Said's Orientalism argued in a similar vein that European and American expert knowledge of the Orient, and particularly the Middle East, was inextricably connected with the exercise of Western hegemony over the region. Such critiques have made anthropologists much more self-conscious about the implications of their own representations of other non-European peoples. James Clifford and George Marcus have been concerned with the ways in which such representations are constructed through writing and the rhetorical means by which anthropologists lay claim to authority. Talal Asad has suggested that anthropologists attempt to arrive at historicized definitions of such phenomena as religion serve to naturalize, that is, make cultural concepts and thought systems appear timeless, natural, and universal, post Enlightenment systems of European thought, while simultaneously problematizing other systems of practice, even in European history. Paul Rainbow has been perhaps the most adamant disciple of Foucault within the discipline, both as an exegete and as an ethnographer of modern France. Derrida and deconstruction. At first sight, Derrida of grammatology, which makes the provocative claim for the logical priority of writing over speech, might not seem a likely candidate for a work that would influence anthropological thinking. Derrida's point is, first of all, that writing reveals the spaces, silences, and erasures that speech conceals. Second, that there is an apparent gap in time and space, a difference between the enunciation and reception of a written text, whereas speech gives the illusion of immediacy. Derrida's purpose is to radically call into question the relevance of authorial intention and the possibility of any fixed meaning. Text, written or spoken, must be interpreted not only in terms of what they say, but of what they keep silent, and with respect to other texts before and after. Derrida's approach to text, deconstruction, lays bare the internal contradictions of any text, precluding the attribution of definitive meaning, intentional or otherwise. The term deconstruction has been used so loosely by many anthropologists that it has lost any clear referent, an ironic fate for a concept intended to challenge the fixity of meaning. More specifically, Derrida's skepticism about intentionality in the interpretation of texts has fueled postmodern critiques of anthropological representations of the other. Derrida's wordplay and elliptical style have inspired new forms of anthropological writing, best exemplified by the work of Michael Toussaint. Claude Levi-Strauss and the Four Tenets of Structuralism. Post-structuralism builds on, but more importantly rejects, some of the central tenets of structuralism, from where it gets its name. For this reason, it is crucial, in order to understand post-structuralism, to start with Claude Levi-Strauss and the structuralist enterprise. Structuralism was the rage in Parisian intellectual circles in the 1960s, but its popularity distorted important differences between the theoretical approaches of the leading intellectuals labeled as structuralist at the time. Of the four key thinkers associated in the public imagination with structuralism, Roland Barthes, Michael Foucault, Jacques Lacan, and Claude Levi-Strauss, only one was strictly speaking structuralist. That was Claude Levi-Strauss, the anthropologist in the group. Claude Levi-Strauss built his structural edifice on the basis of the structural linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure, whose lectures on linguistic theory were published posthumously by his students in the now famous Cours de Linguistique Générale. In a concise and useful essay entitled Structural Analysis, Levi-Strauss summarized the central tenets of structural linguistics. First, structural linguistics shifts from the study of conscious linguistic phenomena to study of their unconscious infrastructure. Second, it does not treat terms as independent entities, taking instead as its basis of analysis the relations between terms. Third, it introduces the concept of system. And finally, structural linguistics aims at discovering general laws either by induction or by logical deduction, which would give them an absolute character. In relation to the four basic tenets of structuralism, post-structuralism builds on the first three tenets but rejects the fourth, the idea that we could discover general laws. It builds on the notion that meanings are derived from relations of difference, that these are largely subconscious, and that they form a structure. But it emphasizes the gaps and ambiguities in the structure of meanings. Levi Strauss had said that, starting from ethnographic experience, I have always aimed at drawing up an inventory of mental patterns to reduce apparently arbitrary data to some kind of order and to attain a level at which a kind of necessity becomes apparent underlying the illusions of liberty. This is precisely what post-structuralism rejects. Post-structuralism resists, then, the fourth tenet. Structures of meanings are not universal and do not reflect ontological truths about humans or society. Post-structuralists focus on those gaps and ambiguities in the system of meaning and find meaning there. The key move of post-structuralism is, how is it that we come to believe the meaning we impose in order to hide the gaps and ambiguities? The central question that post-structuralists pose in their work is precisely how knowledge becomes possible at any particular time under specific historical conditions. In Foucault's words, the question is, how is it that the human subject turns himself into an object of possible knowledge? Through what forms of rationality, under what historical conditions, and finally at what price? My question is this one. At what price can the subject tell the truth about himself? Foucault's perspective, in effect, asks a different set of questions than the structuralists, but derived from the structuralist framework. Foucault is interested in the history of knowledge and rationality, the history of the subject. How is it possible that any of these discourses, existentialism, structuralism, or practice theory, could be received as correct, useful, intelligible? How does the process of making a discourse true shape the way we as subjects judge, think, categorize, desire the other? How is it that we turn ourselves into objects of study? This is not to suggest, of course, that discourses do not become true. They certainly have. They are true to many of us. But that is not the issue for Foucault. The real question is, how is it that they have come to be seen as true at this particular time? Post-structuralism and Foucault's project thus bear a strained relationship to structuralism, building on parts but rejecting others. Foucault himself was adamant that he was not structuralist. In contrast to other forms of critical theory, post-structuralism focuses on the social distribution of power associated with the construction of knowledge that has come to be known as power or knowledge critique. How exactly do we come to believe what we hold as true? How is it, for instance, that we come to believe a progressive narrative of punishment? What institutions and practices shape us to believe in the idea of the delinquent, or for that matter, in the idea that we could possibly rehabilitate or correct that delinquent? How have our own disciplinary practices contributed to shaping our beliefs, and at what cost? As noted earlier in her book Gender Trouble, Judith Butler locates post-structuralism in the work of Derrida. If, as we suggest, her definition is right, then why the different location? Why not in Derrida, one may ask? Why do we classify Derrida as a deconstructionist and distinguish deconstruction from post-structuralism? The primary reason, I would argue, is that deconstruction never embraces the moment of developing an explanation, a complex social, theoretic, historical, and genealogical explanation for how we come to believe what we do believe. Foucault does, for instance, when he meticulously explains how we came to believe that it was right to judge the soul of the delinquent, not just the delinquent act, in discipline and punish. Deconstructive practice does not provide explanation, nor does it analyze the price we pay when we do that. It does not flesh out the distributive consequences of those ethical choices. It identifies the choice but stops there. Deconstruction, in effect, never overcomes the radical moment of ambiguating meaning, which distinguishes it significantly from post-structuralist work. One can see this well in a text like Course de Loi, the first part of which is a keynote lecture that Derrida delivered in October 1989 at a conference titled Deconstruction and the Possibility of Justice in New York City. The text is fascinating and plays on the structural relations between law and justice, but it does not move significantly past the slippage once it has identified the ethical choice. Relying on a pensée of Pascal, Derrida excavates in Force de Loi the basis of a modern critique of liberal legalism. The pensée in question concerns the relationship between justice, law, and might, and is indeed provocative. It is important then to bring together justice and might, and to do that, or to that end, to make sure that which is just be strong, and that which is strong be just. This exposes for Derrida the mystical foundation of the authority of law and enables a modern critique of liberal legalist ideology. The foundation of law, Derrida suggests, is precisely the force required to first create, inaugurate, or found the law itself. This, Derrida suggests, requires a leap of faith and thus represents coup the force, and it exposes deconstructive possibilities. It makes possible, according to Derrida, the very possibility of deconstruction, which is precisely what leads him, paradoxically, to assert that la déconstruction est la chasse. What he means by that is that it is precisely the auto-authorization of law, the moment of the appeal to faith in law itself that represents the moment of rupture, of indeterminacy, and of force that makes possible the critique of liberal legalism, and that represents the moment of deconstructive practice. In typical fashion, it represents a Derridian inversion of the very title of the conference, Deconstruction and the Possibility of Justice. It is justice because it is self-authorizing that creates the possibility of critique, and thus the possibility of deconstruction. Notice here, though, and importantly, that Derrida does not take the further step, which is associated with post-structuralism, of offering a social, theoretic, historical, or genealogical account of how we come to take that central leap of faith. Derrida stops with the identification itself. In the end, then, post-structuralism should be distinguished from deconstruction and represents the penultimate stage of modernity. It is the stage where we began to focus on the ambiguity in meaning as the central location at the edge of critical reason that helps identify ethical choice. Derridian construction, one can argue, comes after post-structuralism and represents the last stage of modernity, no longer willing to offer thick descriptions of how we come to take our leaps of faith. Deconstruction focuses only on the ethical choice itself. What comes after deconstruction? Perhaps the absolute acknowledgement of the limits of critical reason and the refusal to take any leap of faith at all. Perhaps a turn instead to randomization. Thank you for watching this presentation. Do like, subscribe, share, and leave your comments about this presentation or any other topics you would like to learn more about.